precise effects. Positively, it enables Williams to move away from the Eurocentric racial politics of Empson, so that although, as Daniel Williams showed earlier, Williams himself has been criticised for his inability to incorporate racial diversity, his work can at least be read as a muted corrective to Empson in this regard. On the other hand, since race and religion are closely linked in Empson's work, getting rid of one also entails getting rid of the other. This has the effect that the opportunity to identify forms of counter-hegemonic relationships that a sociology of religious organisations can provide is missed. And in fact, Williams interprets organisations of religion mostly as organs of the dominant ideology. It's quite interesting, for example, that in the essay Culture is Ordinary that we were talking about earlier, the cathedral in Hereford is the example of the high art, which is Williams's target. In general, he associates organisations of religion with social and political control. The problem with this assumption is that it fails to account for how the kinds of relationship that typify faith-based communities of all kinds are also inflected and complicated by experiences of race, and can therefore provide instances of counter-hegemonic solidarity. This, I will go on to argue, is why it's worth reading Williams's work alongside his exact contemporary, Paulo Freire, because in Freire's work, a connection between a critical racial politics and an acknowledgement of the contribution certain religious communities can potentially make to that politics can be re-established. In doing so, it adds nuance to our current thinking about both race and religion. So first of all, William Empson. The original occasion for Empson's Structure of Complex Words in 1951 seems to have been a reaction against the doctrines of high literary modernism. In the work, I'm naturally thinking of mainly English language poets here, of those modernists who were also literary critics, there was a repeated assertion of the idea that poetry is impersonal, and therefore that the poetic self should be extinct. Empson, on the other hand, was interested in adding to the technical approach to literary language another approach based on cognition at the emotional level. In doing so, he acknowledged the formative influence on his thinking about language of a number of his own predecessors and contemporaries, most notably the theorist I.R. Richards. However, he found in Richards an insistence on the idea that the emotional content of language can somehow be separated from its surface meaning, and that as a result, words can only ever have one singular primary sense at any particular time. Empson, by contrast, was interested in the fact that due to historical variation, single words can carry a range of semantic meaning. Indeed, tracing the emergence of those different uses is in large part the purpose of the book, The Structure of Complex Words. And it enabled Empson to argue that owing to this range of meanings, a series of emotional connotations can be generated rather than a singularity of meaning. He says, for example, Professor Richards conceives the sense of a word in a given use as something single, however elaborate, and therefore thinks that anything beyond that sense has got to be explained in terms of feelings, and feelings, of course, are emotions or tones. But much of what appears to us as feeling, as is obvious in the case of a complex metaphor, will in fact be quite an elaborate structure of related meanings. In other words, Emerson was interested in finding ways of expressing the combination of sense, mood, and emotion in a given articulation of a particular word in its cultural and historical specificity, so that identifying the emotive content with which he is chiefly concerned is above all a matter of separating and distinguishing between the whole range of related meanings within the overall expression. In fact, he proposed an elaborate system of notation to show how particular words can be equated with radically different feelings. Since these change over time, the structure of meaning that he talks about is really the articulation in language of historically different uses of the same word for different concepts, each of which is in a meaningful sense co-present at the moment of usage. He says, no doubt there are permanent equations which are more important than the period ones, but the period ones are easier to notice, and there is more need to notice them if you're to get the right reading. And also, they allow you to examine the machinery of change. Having established the overall system of notation, Emerson goes on to apply it to readings of established texts within the literary and historical canon. In the process, he effectively treats texts as discursive spaces in which the clash between different senses and different implications of certain key words becomes particularly manifest. As a result, his main argument is that one prominent word, when used in a range of different senses, holds the key to interpreting a given literary text. For example, he says about the word honest, as a source of historical information, the New English Dictionary is particularly good on the word honest, and I need to explain why it's not supposed to have done enough. It does little about the interaction of senses with feelings, which for a word like this is the chief difficulty. And since it has to give a historical survey, it does not attempt to show the structure of the word at a given date. The main point in showing structure would be to say which sense acted as the head one, because the interaction of senses with feelings turns largely on that. I do not say that the work could ever be done completely. No doubt different groups would be giving the word different structures, even at one date. To anyone who is familiar with the work of Raymond Williams, this talk about the relationship between words, feelings, meanings, and the way in which they're structured together is obviously quite familiar, which is why later on in the paper I will establish strongly how far Williams's work is rooted in Emerson's. At times, though, Emerson misleadingly gives the impression that rather than merely using certain suggestive words to illustrate broad social transformations over the historical period, writers in the literary historical canon actually wrote their works about the words themselves. For example, his discussion of the character the Fool in Shakespeare's King Lear argues that the play instantiates a gradual historical drift from Erasmus's Renaissance understanding of the term fool. That is, a normal man, unencumbered by complex challenges, who nevertheless has the ability to understand complicated matters in a way that his purported betters cannot, towards a post-Reformation meaning relating to the loss of wits and the onset of insanity. But since post-Reformation the loss of wits is related to the shattering of natural order, its implication is that at stake is not merely the welfare of the individual, but the end of the world. specifically the end of God's world. As a result, the conflict between different uses of the term "fool" enables Emerson to situate the play King Lear in a post-Reformation Christian orbit. If basing the entire analysis of the play on this one word seems a stretch, then the number of pages Emerson dedicates to Shakespeare's attitudes to dogs seems absurd by modern standards. Analysing the use of the word dog in the play Timon of Athens, Emerson attributes Shakespeare's apparent dislike of dogs to his not belonging to the hunting class. The particular irony is that whereas the word dog had mainly negative connotations when used in literary symbolism in Europe before Shakespeare's time, in his time, it was actually starting to take on a range of more positive virtues, typically loyalty and steadfastness. Apparently disliking dogs himself, Emerson suggests, Shakespeare seems to have used the older application of the term in Timon of Athens, in spite of the changes taking place in his own world. But just as the reading of "fum" in King Lear turned out to have implications for Reformation doctrine, so in Timon of Athens, Emerson associates the growing reputation of dogs in literature to the development of Enlightenment humanism. The fundamental novelty was an idea, quote, that man is no longer an abortive deity born in sin, necessarily incomplete in the world, but the most triumphant of the animals. To call him a dog playfully is thus to insist on his rights. The argument is that recognizing human qualities in animals, and vice versa, made it possible to see the evolutionary potential in all living things in equal measure, thereby refuting the pre-Reformation doctrine of the innate fallenness of man. Quote, there was indeed a widespread feeling towards evolution before Darwinism, such as both uses of dog sentiment would suggest. The different implications behind the word dog at precisely this point of historical change therefore situates the play in a period of transition between a medieval theology of original sin and an Enlightenment perspective based on the evolutionary perspective of living things, for whom God is now no longer reckoned as the sole creator, but rather the custodian or guarantor. A similar shift away from the medieval worldview and towards that of the European Enlightenment is also discernible in the application of the discussion of the word honest to Shakespeare's Othello, where Emerson explores how the play dramatizes a historical shift in meaning from deserving honor to telling the truth or even keeping a promise. However, the discussion of Othello also introduces a number of problematic assumptions, mainly as a result of Emerson's reading of the play in the context of Protestant England's relationship with Catholic Spain in Shakespeare's period. Drawing attention to the fact that the word used to refer to Othello in the play, a Moor, was a word more likely to have been used in Spain to refer to its North African others than in either England, where the play was written, or Venice, where it is set.
Or Veneza, onde... I'm sorry, Professor, go on.
Causes Emerson to see the play as expressing a fault line in the relationship between the countries. That is, he considers how far it can be considered an allegory of England's relationship with Spain, even though it's not ostensibly about either country. Even granted that this is the case, it would then be difficult to identify which character in the play specifically corresponds to which element in the historical relationship between the countries. Othello, as a violent and imminently threatening general, might feel like a representation of the Spanish Empire, but the play's construction of his racial otherness also positions him as an enemy of that empire. Empson says, "The Othello we are asked to believe in is no longer even like a Spaniard. In fact, one could connect him with the Spaniards the other way round. As one of the noble Spaniards, one of the noble savages, they were ill-treated. It seems to have been a regular claim of people like Drake that the West Indians or whatnot would welcome them and supply their ships on the basis of both hating the Spaniards. To be sure, one feels there is more to be known. Whether Shakespeare had ever seen a Negro seems a relevant question which might be answered. One would like to know why the idea of marrying a European princess to a Negro comes into The Tempest and The Merchant of Venice, as well as here." You will notice the very dismissive way in which Empson himself talks about the West Indians or whatnot, and the general condescending tone that Empson himself has here towards racial others. Admittedly, the point of the discussion of a Spanish Othello is to analyse varying connotations of the word honest in their historical context. In the process, however, Empson repeats the racial othering that he found in the play by classifying Othello not only as a Moor, but also as a Negro, thereby making him appear as absolutely other, not only for Shakespeare's audience in the 1600s, but also for Empson's own readers in the 1950s. In a book specifically dedicated to exploring how the evolution of specific words indicates conflicts over social value, that the absolutely fundamental word Negro should remain completely unexamined and is in fact passed on without question, is a significant shortcoming. Annie Alumba has shown how words to refer to colours came to acquire connotations for different human emotions is precisely the history of racism. And as it is with colours, so it is with other forms of behaviour. In a rather prurient footnote, Empson states that the scholar Mr. G.B. Harrison has produced some amusing evidence that there was a negress prostitute in Shakespeare's London who may have been the dark lady of Shakespeare's sonnets. This fascination with the question of whether or not Shakespeare had ever seen a black person uncomfortably parallels a comment Empson makes in his commentary about animals in Timon of Athens, where he said, quote, "It is difficult to find out exactly who in London had seen apes and when. The creatures need to be big, I fancy, if they are to impose any searching reflections." Although Empson does not make the connection between these two comments explicit, the close juxtaposition of two almost identical comments, one to refer to North African people and the other to apes, feels strongly redolent of much subsequent and vile racist abuse. As we have seen, the discussion of the fool in Lear is related to Empson's adumbration of post-Reformation Christian thought. But the close congruence between it and what he says about black African people in Othello means that his handling of the politics of religion is inseparable from his treatment of race, and both reveal an outmoded Eurocentric attitude. This Eurocentricity is then repeated in the discussion of pre-Enlightenment ideas of evolution in Timon of Athens, where the suggestion of a post-Reformation Christian worldview is couched in animal language that perhaps unwittingly reinforces the animalist metaphors of much racist ideology. Owing to this uncomfortable imbrication of Eurocentrism with both religion and race, the central paradox of the structure of complex words is this: a study devoted to exploring how archaic words becomes supplemented by new meanings, ends up feeling hopelessly, historically remote. One of the purposes of this paper is to draw attention to the significant formative influence of William Empson's linguistic method on Raymond Williams's now better known modes of culture analysis, while also evaluating how far Williams's handling of racial politics could be read as a corrective to Empson's. Williams's concept structure of feeling is a direct heir to Empson's structure of meaning. And in fact, Williams and Michael Oram first used structure of feeling in the book Preface to Film in 1954, only 3 years after Empson, although, as Middleton points out, it was comparatively little noticed at the time. Sean Matthews has shown that Williams used the term structure of feeling with varying implications across his career, and that it was in fact a work in process that he continued to develop over time. But the general tendency is to draw attention to how, when we think about the relationship between the present and the past, it's important to resist the temptation to paint these periods in very broad brushstrokes, based perhaps on a couple of known facts, and then extrapolating from these into an impression of the whole society at any given time. Because people do not, in fact, apprehend history as history, they are not yet aware of what will subsequently be constructed as the predominant characteristics of their world, so that when history is experienced, it is experienced in a wide social, political, and emotional range. That is, the character and makeup of a given society at any given time are always more complex and multifaceted than any singular impression would suggest. And Williams uses the term structure of feeling to replace simplicity with complexity. Quote, "It is as firm and definite as the word structure suggests, yet it operates in the most delicate and least tangible parts of our activity." In an early use of the concept structure of feeling in The Long Revolution in 1961, Williams follows Empson's application of the linguistic method to literary analysis very closely by drawing attention to the fact that the structure of feeling inherited from a given period is often particularly visible in its arts and literature, because here, quote, "in the only examples we have of recorded communication that outlives its bearers, the actual living sense, the deep community that makes the communication possible, is naturally drawn upon." Not only does this closely follow the assumption and method of Empson, but also the adoption of a key word as a critical concept in cultural analysis is the next component in the general theory that Williams takes from him. He says, "A key word in such analysis is pattern. It is with the discovery of patterns of a characteristic kind that any useful cultural analysis begins. And it is with the relationships between these patterns, which sometimes reveal unexpected identities and correspondences in hitherto separately considered activities, sometimes again reveal discontinuities of an unexpected kind, that general cultural analysis is concerned." To go from Empson in 1951 to Williams in The Long Revolution 10 years later is fascinating, because it reveals the gradual genealogy not only of the structure of feeling, but also of the now commonplace concept of a key word. In Empson's literary-orientated work, the purpose of identifying one or two such words in a given literary work is to make them the basis of exegesis of meaning of the whole. there is a case more or less halfway between the nonce use of an ambiguity and the period flavour in a word, that is, the key word of a long poem or complete play, in which the structure of meaning for the word is gradually built up. That's Emerson. By the time of Williams's long revolution in 1961, the idea of a keyword has become more explicitly articulated as a keyword. The term has ceased to be used as a general descriptor, that is, a particular word which holds the interpretative key for any given text, and has instead become more firmly established as a more precise concept. However, the purpose of developing a new concept is never simply to coin a stylish new term. It is to enable new ways of understanding culture. This is where Williams begins to break away from Emerson, because as we've seen, Emerson's method was above all a textualizing one, whereas Williams was starting to develop a sense of what is lost when things like art and literature come to be treated in isolation from other aspects of society. He had opened his book Culture and Society, 1958, with a discussion of the terms industry, democracy, class, art, and culture, in order to trace the social history by which it had become common to think of art and culture as specialist activities, separable and separated from the whole nexus of social processes. This separation of artistic thought from industry and politics, for example, I think accounts for the example mentioned by Daniel Williams earlier of Williams's surprising generosity to a writer like Burke, who is very strongly implicated in that process. He also gives the example of the Romantic poets, who, owing to this historical separation between literature and other activities, come to be seen as they're somehow in isolation from the rest of the world. The idea of the Romantic retreat from the world dates from then. This separation had occurred in Britain mainly during its transition from a rural society to an industrial one. And in fact, I think during Deborah's paper this morning, you briefly talked about the importance of the Industrial Revolution in Britain as laying the key elements of class and domination between the classes, and therefore the forms of hegemony which would come to exist in typically industrial societies. It's during the Industrial Revolution in Britain that this separation between art and, say, sociology and politics came to be established. And it had the effect of mystifying the class structure created as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Restoring a material, as distinct from an abstract history, to that process of how the class structure arose was then the crucial first step towards class consciousness and the adoption of a cultural politics of resistance to the dominant class. In other words, owing to the connection between literature and history, there's a commitment to critiquing ideological structures in Williams that is muted in Emerson as a result of his habit of treating literary texts as privileged objects of analysis. Having made this break, Williams would expand upon it throughout his career. His 1976 study, Key Words, began life as an appendix to Culture and Society, but Williams found there was so much to say on the subject that it expanded to fill an entire book. What is notable is that not only has Williams stopped using keyword as a general descriptor, like Emerson, he has also stopped using it with the awkward hyphenization of the Long Revolution. So if we look at the example on this screen from the Long Revolution, keyword has that slightly awkward hyphen in the middle of it because the term itself doesn't yet exist. But in short, by 1976, keyword has become a word. With it came a critical theoretical concept that reached its highest expression in Williams's Marxism and Literature in 1977. where he revisits the idea of a structure of feeling, but this time has much more to say about it. The term is difficult, but feeling is chosen to emphasize a distinction from more formal concepts of worldview or ideology. We are concerned with meanings and values as they are actively lived and felt, and the relations between these and formal or systematic beliefs are, in practice, variable. An alternative definition would be structures of experience. We're talking about characteristic elements of impulse, restraint, and tone, specifically affective elements of consciousness and relationships, not feeling against thought, but thought as felt and feeling as thought, practical consciousness of a present kind in a living and interrelating continuity. We are then defining these elements as a structure, that is, as a set with specific internal relations at once interlocking and in tension. Yet we are also defining social experience which is still in process, often indeed not yet recognized as social, but taken to be private, idiosyncratic, and even isolating, but which in analysis has its emergent, connecting, and dominant characteristics. It's noticeable here that when Williams considers an alternative term for structures of feeling, he does not return to Emerson's structures of meaning, but advocates instead the idea of structure of experience. The point of cultural analysis now is not to elucidate what this or that word really means, but to see words as parts of whole texts, which are in turn articulations of real material relationships at a given point in time, so that the reading of the words is, in a purposeful sense, a reading of the relationships themselves. Moreover, this is the precise point in Williams's thought at which the idea that a structure of feeling is always in process lays the foundation for his vocabulary of dominant, emergent, and also residual ideologies. In his discussion of structures of feeling in The Long Revolution, Raymond Williams acknowledged the complexity of the concept, and in an attempt to provide a practical example of it, he wrote, "I think we can best understand this if we think of any similar analysis of a way of life that we ourselves share." He goes on, "We are usually most aware of this when we read an account of our lives by someone from outside the community, or watch the small differences in style or speech or behaviour in someone who has learned our ways, yet was not bred in them. Though it can be turned to trivial account, the fact of such a characteristic is neither trivial nor marginal. It feels quite central." The rhetoric of insider-outsider, especially with regard to somebody who has learned the ways of the community without having been born into them, is strongly reminiscent of a concern repeatedly expressed by Emerson for students of English language from other countries, potentially perplexed by the range and nuance of meaning in a given word and the jarring effect this can create. At the same time, it raises questions about the we and our ways Williams refers to. In a related essay on Wales and England in 1983, Williams argued that the common habit in Wales to identify with Celts, in contradistinction to the imagined Anglo-Saxons of England, is the result of a series of misidentifications, which are themselves caused by the binary us-them thinking of some nationalist politics. In place of this binary, Williams suggests an idea of complex history which overrides the distinction between England and Wales in these tribal terms, and instead attempts to think about the real relationships in material terms. He says, We need not stay long in one of the most populated regions, that of race. The ethnic history of what is now Wales is one of extreme complexity from the earliest times. There seem to be quite basic differences between the Neolithic and Bronze Age settlers and the Iron Age arrivals, though in legend and platitude, all tend to be assimilated in terms of the subsequent contrast with Saxons and to be confused as Celts. When this last difficult description is asserted, we have to reply that on the available evidence, the Celts were the first invading linguistic imperialists. It's quite dark in my study now. I'm just going to pause to turn on the light. Ta-da! William's assertion here that the category of race needs no further examination might seem slightly ominous, even though at this point, even at this stage, his main argument is really that compared to the English, the Welsh are not a race, but a cultural construct. To critique the too easy identification with the Celts that he found common in Wales is to unpick a mythologized version of Welsh history by refusing to see the Welsh people or their culture as if they were categorical essences, rather than historical and historically varying artifacts. If there's one thing to insist on in analysing Welsh culture, it is the complex of forced and acquired discontinuities. This is a quote. A broken series of radical shifts within which we have to mark not only certain social and linguistic communities, but many acts of self-definition by negation. The overall argument is that what are often taken to be fundamental elements of Welsh culture are best seen in the context of these forced shifts, discontinuities, and conquests. In other words, a number of experiences of defeat, penetration, and incorporation over a very long-term historical time period have inflected the typical elements of Welsh culture in a variety of ways, including at times provoking them into existence through counter-affirmation. Thus, for example, the labour movement and commitment to class consciousness in the advocation of modern forms of democracy, which are frequently and rightly treated as important features of Welsh culture, are recognised by Williams as a response to the conditions and relationships historically created by the Industrial Revolution, taking place both outside Wales as well as inside. In other words, this typical feature of Welsh culture is not innate, but a response to those specific historical conditions inflicted from outside. Moreover, in an earlier period, that of the English Civil War, 1642 to 46, most of Wales had favoured the royalist side. And Williams points out that although an earlier royalist Wales is not easily included in the projection of a radical and democratic Welsh essence, it nevertheless makes more sense that Wales was like that when England was going the other way. Perhaps the best example he gives, however, is religious nonconformism. For a complex variety of reasons, religious nonconformity has historically been treated as one of the most important features of Wales's culture. This is partly because ideas of common organisation, shared responsibility, and advancement through education, which are staples of nonconformist thought, can be more easily squared with the idea of a modern social democratic Wales than its earlier incarnation as a bastion of monarchic culture. More significantly, the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century and the contemporary Act of Union, 1536, which legally bound Wales to England, had resulted in the imposition in Wales of a religious organisation, the Church of England, as an organ of relative political control. That it worshipped in English at a time when the overwhelming majority of people in Wales spoke Welsh, therefore limited the cultural and political power of the Welsh people over their own affairs, so that nonconformist chapels, whose congregations were mainly Welsh-speaking, were important alternatives to the official church. Moreover, the Welsh Church Act of 1919, which disestablished the Church of England as the official church in Wales, acknowledged the greater congruence of nonconformism than Anglican Christianity with the Welsh people. Since the Welsh Church Act was the first piece of British law in 400 years to apply to the whole of Wales and only to Wales, it has been interpreted as a milestone towards the regaining of greater political autonomy in Wales that came about later in the 20th century. In other words, nonconformity has an important place in Wales's culture and history, yet Raymond Williams interrogates the assumption of its inherent position there, arguing instead that, quote, the cultural forms in which a subordinated people try to express their distinctive identity can be specifically quite discontinuous, and these discontinuities are better related to the realities of subordination than to the idealizations of a submerged essence. These quotes from Raymond Williams can sometimes be very specific indeed. I find myself tripping over the words. I am therefore all the more admiring of our translators. More specifically, Williams points out that nonconformism itself, so long treated as a staple of Wales's culture, actually arose in certain industrial communities in England at the time of the Industrial Revolution and came in over the English border. His point is not that the pursuit of social responsibility, common purpose, and shared undertaking that nonconformity can provide has not been operative in Wales, but that its very presence in Wales is testament to the material history of the relationship between Wales and England. In other words, the history is more complex than surface identification of this or that feature of Welsh culture would suggest. And religious organisations, even those like nonconformist ones that arose in opposition to the dominant political formations of the time, are shown to relate to the dominant ideology. In fact, this is how Williams treats religious organisations overall, from castles and palaces and churches to prisons and workhouses and schools, from weapons of war to a controlled press. Any ruling class, in variable ways, though always materially, produces a social and political order. In another essay again, The Culture of Nations, 1983, Williams returned to the theme of how very complex histories have tended to be reduced to artificial essences in the construction and promulgation of particular versions of British culture as a whole. He tells an anecdote about a politician opposing British entry into the European Economic Community in 1973 on the grounds that it would be supposedly the end of 1,000 years of history. Williams responds, "Why 1,000, I wondered. The only meaningful date by that reckoning would be somewhere around 1066, when a Norman French replaced a Norse Saxon monarchy. What then of the English? That would be some 1,500 years. The British, some 2,500. But the real history of the peoples of these islands goes back very much further than that." There's something sadly topical here about Williams's engagement with the arguments for Britain entering the European Community in the 70s in the light of recent history in Britain. His argument here is again that the British people are not Britons or Romans, Anglo-Saxons or Celts, Vikings or Normans, but a culturally fostered and ideologically legitimated combination of all of them into a unified political identity called the British. In therefore refusing an ethnic basis for defining either Wales or England, he goes on, quote, "All the varied people who have lived on this island are, in a substantial physical sense, still here. What is from time to time projected as an island race is in reality a long process of successive conquests and repressions, but also of successive supersessions and relative integrations. All the real processes have been cultural and historical, all the artificial processes have been political. To read this passage, however, is to notice a contradiction in Williams's thinking, a contradiction that was already there in his earlier vague references to people who are either inside or outside a particular community. I think it's important to try and unpick the contradiction because it reveals in turn a degree of short-sightedness in Williams's approach to such sensitive issues as ethnicity, immigration, and ultimately race. The argument he asks us to accept is in effect that all the peoples who inhabit the island of Britain have been there all along, but at the same time, some of them have apparently been there longer than others. He says, "It is here that there is now a major problem in the most recent immigrations of more visibly different peoples. When these interact with the most recent selective forms of identity, the true-born Englishman, who, apart from an occasional afterthought, is made to stand for the whole complex of settled, native, and earlier immigrant peoples, or the imperial British, who, in a new common identity, used economic and military advantages to rule 100 peoples across the world and to assume an inborn superiority to them, the angry confusions and prejudices are obvious." Williams's contradictory logic draws out into the open the troubling assumptions implicit in his discussion in The Long Revolution of how the best ways of understanding the concept of the structure of feeling is to read an account of our own community written by someone outside it, or to observe the small differences in style and behaviour between members of that community and someone who lives within it but was not born to it. The question this rhetoric leaves unexamined is precisely, to whom does this we and our community refer? For a cultural theorist of black British history such as Paul Gilroy, as discussed extensively by Daniel Williams earlier, the decisive answer is therefore not us. Instead, it raises another question. Writing with specific reference to Williams, Gilroy says in There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, "How long is long enough to become a genuine Brit?" His, that is Williams's, insistence that the origins of racial conflicts lie in the hostility between strangers in the city makes little sense, given the effects of the 1971 Immigration Act in halting primary black settlement. More disturbingly, these arguments effectively deny that blacks can share a significant social identity with their white neighbours, who, in contrast to more recent arrivals, inhabit what Williams calls rooted settlements, articulated by lived and formed identities of a settled kind. According to Jim McGuigan, although Gilroy's angry response to Williams was justified, he nevertheless went too far in equating Williams with other explicitly racist figures of the period, such as Enoch Powell, again an example that Daniel Williams discussed earlier. The important to make here is that both the critique of Williams and the qualified defence of him cut both ways. Relative to the extreme Eurocentrism of William Empson, who saw no problem in juxtaposing a discussion of the first time Europeans saw apes with one about the first time Europeans saw Africans, and left the word Negro suspiciously unexamined, Williams's assertion of racial and cultural complexity seems more sophisticated. Yet the temporal ambiguity at the heart of Williams's writing about race prompted Gilroy quite rightly to ask whether black and immigrant communities could ever therefore be considered comparably British to those living in the rooted settlements and with the formed identities Williams discussed. For black British citizens of the 1970s and 1980s, one corresponding form of rootedness and identity In short, one variation of Williams's cherished notion of community historically came from gospel churches. Given that this was a period when structural racism against black people was highly prevalent in Britain, the form of community, the comradeship, the relationships of support and aspiration provided by those churches cannot fail to have been at least somewhat counter-hegemonic, because even where they had little or no ostensible political orientation, the mere fact of their existence was testament to the assertion of belonging and settlement that in many cases was undermined or denied. Williams, by contrast, as we've seen, was unable to see religious organisations as anything other than vehicles of the dominant ideology. Moreover, this assumption about organised religion is inseparable from the blind spots in his thinking about race. As we've seen, his assertion that all the peoples of Britain had been already there all along is intended as a corrective to the practice common in nationalist thought of treating the difference between England and Wales as an ethnic difference, when really it's a historical one, based on cultural practice and political ideology. This argument then leads him directly into a discussion of how the typical elements of Welsh culture, its Catholic royalism during the English Civil War, its dissenting nonconformism from the 18th century onwards, are not cultural essences, but specific responses to the dominant ideologies of the period. Moreover, although nonconformism ostensibly rejected the then dominant politics of Anglican worship and the English language, Williams nevertheless implicitly assumes that the forms of solidarity associated with it are instances of the settled and historically complete communities which Gilroy thought were unable to incorporate ethnic diversity precisely because they were settled. Given that this is the case, it's hard to see them, or at least Williams's way of thinking about them, as instances of counter-hegemonic practice with regard to the dominant, highly racialized structures of his time. And this is why it's worth reading Williams alongside his contemporary, Paulo Freire, because although there's no direct question of influence between Freire and Williams, as there clearly is between Empson and Williams, and although we cannot be certain whether or not Williams had even read Freire, Freire restores the possibility of a radical, critical, oppositional politics that is both attuned to the inequalities of race and expressed within anti-establishment religious organisations of the kind that Williams could not imagine. So this is the third section of the paper. Having gone into exile from Brazil following the military coup of 1964, first in Bolivia and Chile, then in the USA and Switzerland, Freire was invited through the World Council of Churches to undertake educational work in the post-colonial West African state of Guinea-Bissau, where he applied the ideas of his most commonly cited work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, 1968, English translation 1970. In it, Freire rejects a form of thinking that he had noticed in a number of newly decolonizing societies, especially in Africa. Specifically, he rejected the assumption that educational structures would be developed in such societies as part of the gradual process of building public services after political independence had been achieved, especially in cases where independence was brought about through revolutionary uprising. This is Freire. Some well-intentioned but misguided persons suppose that since the dialogical process is prolonged, which incidentally is not true, they ought to carry out the revolution without communication by means of communiques, and that once the revolution is won, they will then develop a thoroughgoing educational effort. They further justify this procedure by saying that it is not possible to carry out education, liberating education, before taking power. Freire does not reject taking power through armed struggle as such, but he does draw attention to the fact that it alone will not create the conditions necessary for independence. This is because the precondition for political revolution is the adoption of a critical counter-hegemonic outlook, which in turn is generated through pedagogical praxis. In other words, education does not follow revolution, but in a meaningful way is a leading factor in its implementation. Moreover, just as independence was not something that could wholly be brought about by the revolutionary activities of the colonized people alone, so too it was not something that could be granted like a gift by the colonizers alone, since Freire squarely rejected their right to grant it. Liberation is then a dialogical process in which independence is developed through the complex interplay of action and critical education, and as a mutually constitutive and transformational process arising out of the encounter between colonizer and colonized. This dialectical approach is the basis of Freire's dialogical approach to education, which entails the replacement of one model of pedagogy with another. In the decolonizing phase of history, the dominant educational practice in Portuguese colonies in Africa had been more orientated towards functional literacy than a politically enabling critical literacy. Who got to study, as well as what, where, when, and how they studied, were all determined by the colonial authorities, with the effect that the content of the curriculum, methods for its dissemination, skills and knowledge generated, and the modes of assessment all contributed in indirect ways, and sometimes in openly direct ways, to the reproduction of the hierarchical social order on which colonial societies were based. Because it involved providing students with just enough knowledge and skills to take their place within that order, but without equipping them with the critical orientation necessary to transform it, Freire referred to this as the banking method of education, symbolically depositing so much knowledge in so many student receptacles for such and such a period of time, so that it can be recovered and cashed in when necessary. The economic metaphor is not incidental, since, as a revolutionary Marxist, Freire makes clear that the relationship between colonizer and colonized is above all an imperial one, based on the capitalist exploitation of the colony and its people. At the heart of the banking concept of education, Freire identifies a symbolic contradiction. Because teachers are frequently members of the community in which they teach, they speak from the same place. That is, they occupy the same discursive position vis-à-vis the colonial authorities as their students and their families. At the same time, because the educational structures were involved in the reproduction of the dominant social order, teachers and students had very different roles to play. Educational advancement depended on the capacity of the students to provide pre-programmed answers to a limited range of functional questions. That is, to pass exams and move into the next year of schooling, they had to reproduce the dominant systems of thought and belief as dictated by the teacher, and hence the relationship between teacher and student was one directional. Owing to this contradiction, Freire, in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, suggests replacing the banking model with what he calls a problem-posing concept of education. Rather than pursuing an externally imposed educational agenda as a vehicle for the ideological legitimation of imperialism, a problem-posing education would give its students the opportunity to develop programs of work that were most important for the circumstances in which they were living. A number of other implications followed from this suggestion. Firstly, since the purpose of problem-posing education is to identify and address challenges that affected all members of the community, not just, and maybe not even primarily, its children, students did not need to be corralled into cohorts on the basis of age, and education could in fact encompass learners of all ages. The opportunity to participate in education across age ranges implied a subtly altered objective in the aim and purpose of education itself, in which individual advancement was again not the primary objective, and where education could be used for the improvement of the community as a whole. At the same time, because teachers themselves are not separate from the communities, they too could participate in this mutual process. thereby replacing the hierarchical relationship between teacher and student with a practice of shared endeavour and joint enterprise that would resolve the contradiction at the heart of the banking concept. Freire's problem-posing education begins with the suggestion that asking questions is more enabling of a critical orientation towards the world than the reproduction of presupplied assumptions or surface answers. A problem-posing education requires creating new program content that is drawn from the world of the students, and this content is identified and discovered through a series of so-called generative themes. As students identify what they're trying to achieve in and for their community, this entails an increasing number of secondary identifications. What barriers are there to achieving the objective? How can these barriers be overcome? Who else is equipped to contribute to the process? Above all, if the program is successful, what will have changed? A practice of problem-posing education offers to contribute to raising the critical as opposed to the merely functional literacy of its students, by creating opportunities to develop their critical consciousness with regard to existing inequalities of power and domination. It enables them to see that what they know of the world is highly mediated, both by their experiences of it and by structures of ideological reproduction, such as culture and education. Where these things do not square up with each other, it further creates opportunities for rejecting the dominant ideology and challenging the inequalities it legitimizes. In the last instance, therefore, rather than a tool of the capitalist imperial order, problem-posing education is an instrument for liberation. To make this change of emphasis in both the object and practice of education in Guinea-Bissau during the period of decolonization required a further transformation, specifically in how educators were trained and prepared. As part of this process, Freire proposed that trainee teachers should study and observe the life of the community in which they would teach, in order to decode apparently surface signifiers of meaning and use them to gain deep insight into the dynamics, power relationships, and challenges in that community. And this is where his pedagogy of liberation connects with a form of liberation theology, with reference to both race and religion. Because in decolonizing West Africa in the 1960s and 1970s, church organizations were frequently more than places of worship, but also sites of belonging and solidarity, and therefore drivers of important social relationships that existed adjacent to the dominant relationships of the colonial hierarchy. Therefore, understanding the position of those relationships in the society was an important step in decoding the power dynamics at work and identifying possible means for harnessing pre-existing relations in the service of a pedagogy of political liberation. This is the last slide. During the decoding stage, the investigators observe certain moments of the life of the area, sometimes directly, sometimes by means of informal conversations with the inhabitants. They register everything in their notebooks, including apparently unimportant items, the way the people talk, their style of life, their behaviour at church and at work. They record the idiom of the people, their expression, their vocabulary and their syntax, not their incorrect pronunciation, but rather the way they construct their thoughts. It seems to me that in this changed emphasis between correcting incorrect pronunciation and rather looking at how people really think and speak, is a kind of parallel with Williams's idea of the ordinariness of culture. Because it's sited in the heart of the community and embodies a number of horizontal relationships, a church is well placed as a point of departure for identifying the generative themes salient to its members. As would later be the case in South Africa during the struggle against apartheid, certain church organisations provided community resources which could be used to germinate forms of counter-hegemonic resistance. The point is not that Freire believed this was always inevitably the role of churches, but it is that owing to their geographical situatedness within communities, plus their theoretical openness to everyone, churches have the potential to foster relationships of opposition, just as much as they do relationships of oppression. This is why Freire also points out that in his commitment to using education to cultivate a radical political consciousness, the World Council of Churches, quote, was offering me more than any university. Perhaps I should say at this point he had not yet worked at the University of Unicamp. That is, a pedagogy of liberation opens in Freire's work onto a form of liberation theology. If I could just sum up my whole paper for a couple of minutes, I would say that in the work of William Empson, understanding the Christian context of certain key words held the key to restoring the correct meaning in a number of literary texts. Yet because the earlier historical meanings turned out to have been lost when language itself underwent change during the European Reformation, his idea of correct meaning was inseparable from both a Christian worldview and a Eurocentric perspective. Raymond Williams drew widely on Empson's method in the development of historical linguistics, but rather than using key words to analyse textual objects, Williams applied them to a newly critical reading of the world and of the dominant ideologies in it. Although Williams's thinking about race was not very sophisticated, it nevertheless avoided the worst excesses of Empson in this regard, but only by associating religion with the dominant ideology and jettisoning it along with race, so that Williams really says little about either. Freire's reading of the relationship between race and religion is implicitly more nuanced, both because working in anti-colonial Guinea-Bissau at the very end of the period of imperialism cannot fail to have involved a highly racialized dimension in the account of the relationship between colonizer and colonized, and because he undertook that work on behalf of a church organization. In other words, the church is no longer, or at least not only, to be seen as an organ of the dominant ideology, and can actually operate as the locus of resistance for the oppressed people, who in that case were also an oppressed, racialized community. In the years since Freire's death, it has become common for his ideas to be adopted in critical race education in the USA. Although Stephen Nathan Haynes has argued that owing to his tendency to collapse race into class, Freire's relevance may be overstated when it comes to African Americans in the United States. Renee Smith Maddox and Daniel G. Solorzano have proposed that combining critical race theory with Freire's problem-posing method offers teacher educators a way to initiate prospective teachers into discourses and pedagogical approaches that meet the needs of students of colour, while the prospective teachers learn how to examine their notion of social justice. They go on to cite certain African American churches that are able to provide numerous educational and legal research questions, literary artistic issues, and related curricular and pedagogical materials associated with people of colour. In the UK, the situation is a little different, because since the 2011 census, for the first time in recorded history, the majority of citizens have identified themselves as having no religion. But although this is true of the British population as a whole, it is not true either of the black British population or indeed of any minority ethnic group in Britain. It is notable that a high number of Britain's public intellectuals are avowed atheists, but almost none of them reveal any consciousness at all of the fact that the atheism of which they are proud is itself partly determined by their privileged position with regard to structures of class and race. Among black and minority ethnic populations, by contrast, atheism is frequently neither possible nor desirable, since black churches have often been among the most important support mechanisms and community resources available. To make this point is not to mystify the practice of faith as such, which is in any case an individual vocation, but it is to draw attention to the forms of social organisation and social behaviour enabled by participation in the relationships and networks of church groups. For this reason, to read Paulo Freire alongside Raymond Williams is to restore a connection between religious organization and the potential for counter-hegemonic practice with regard to race. Thank you.
Excelente, Professor Dix. Muito obrigado.
Excellent, Professor Dix. Thank you very much. From the bottom of our hearts. We have 3 questions from YouTube for you. And before I ask the questions, I would like to make a brief comment of an experience that I had between Williams and a sociologist of German literature. I actually wrote about this in 2015. The sociologist is called Livim Shukin, and he wrote about the Puritan family from 1929. He talks about English for a vocabulary to think about emotions. And that's where he formulated also an idea of a structure of feeling. He actually used the same term. And I thought it was very interesting and rich, this concept, structure of feeling, with William Epson. And it's very interesting to see that as well, that in the sociology of German literature pre-war, this term was also being used to talk about the emotions that the vocabulary of the English language expressed. So I would just like to thank you and to say how rich your lecture was. I'm going to move on to the questions, Professor. The first one, have Débora asking, the work of Paulo Freire and Raymond Williams promoted a new meaning and a new value to the educational practices and culture. How do you understand the shift? And the second question, by José Afonso Chaves, he says, Professor Dix, during your lecture, the concept of structure of feeling emphasized the condition of process, a relationship conditioned practically, in my opinion, to very wide concepts. Could we compare it to the zeitgeist or some other wide concepts in sociology? And the last question is from Michael Guimarães, and he says, how can we give a new meaning of culture in an intense moment of cultural invasion in Brazil? A neo-colonial, necropolitical, and neo-fascist invasion of culture in Brazil as we are living currently. Professor, when you're ready to answer, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. The first comment from Alexandro wasn't really a question, but as you were talking, I kind of received it in my mind as if it was a question and was preparing myself to say something about that. One of the things I think about Raymond Williams is an under-recognized feature of his work is that he drew attention to the importance of distinguishing between different kinds of emotional experience. I think emotion is not always the first word that comes to mind when people think about Williams. And I would guess that is probably because his work has a very abstract element. Probably, for example, Marxism and Literature is the single work in which he lays out the ideas of how to critique the sociology of culture in a most coherent way, but it is also almost entirely abstract. The number of concrete examples from literature or history or politics in that book is very few indeed. So I think this sense of abstraction creates a sense that Williams's work is theoretical but emotionless at times. But I find when I read his work, one of the things that emerges from it strongly is the need to conceptualize emotional experience. So that is something that I kind of guess you would take from it, from the idea of the structure of feeling and the Shukin example that you used, the way of having a vocabulary for talking about emotions in our daily life, in our family and in our normal relationships. So that I think is really important. I think one of the lectures this morning, I think it was Louisa's, concluded her paper about Freire by talking about the importance of hope. And that also is something that has a really central place in Williams's thoughts, in the collection by Williams entitled Resources of Hope. He talks about the fact that the goal of political activists, as well as theoretical critics, is to try and make hope practical. So again, there is this combination of abstract ideas and heavy work with emotional experience. The full quote is the challenge of making hope practical and not despair convincing. In fact, I really strongly thought of those words when we listened to Louisa's paper this morning, because she finished with a Freire comment that seemed to be almost identical to that. And that idea of the commitment to hope really is a commitment to the idea that things can be better, which of course is the goal of all critical transformational practice. If I may, I will answer next the question about zeitgeist, because it kind of follows on from that. The short answer is yes. The zeitgeist, as I kind of think about it, is all about what a particular moment feels like. And as such, it's always retrospectively mediated. So I think now, for example, about the zeitgeist of the 90s. What did it feel like to be in Britain then? What did it sound like? What music were people listening to? What voices did I hear on TV? What were the ideas? It's a kind of sensory impression as much as it's a collection of factual knowledge. And it does tend to come about after the event. I wouldn't typically apply the term zeitgeist to the term 2021, unless I was really strongly anticipating some kind of posterior life to my own work. I would probably only apply the term zeitgeist to 2021 in 2040, when I look back at it and mediate it retrospectively. So the zeitgeist is useful because it has this combination of historical period plus emotion, what it feels like, and also I think really because of the retrospective element. When Williams develops the vocabulary of dominant, residual, and emergent cultures in Marxism and literature, the dominant ideology is always his target, and residual forms of dominant practice tend to be ones that are a little bit old-fashioned but still have some kind of power. Actually, religion is one of those, that he gives as an example, that it's part of the dominant ideology, even though specifically in Britain, religion is not quite as powerful as it once was. It's still inherently part of the dominant ideology. And the emergent, of course, comes about when the first seeds of opposition begin to gather themselves together in opposition to the dominant. And in fact, there's an even more complex concept, the pre-emergent. That is, before emerging oppositional elements of a culture come out into the open and name themselves as such, and therefore, again, are only really able to be identified as such retrospectively. It might be, for example, that Williams later on started talking about environmentalism, green politics, and the future of the environment as a socialist issue. In Williams's life and work, because that's at the end of his career, the idea of environmental politics as such at that period probably was a pre-emergent thing. it wasn't a widely spread kind of oppositional politics in the 60s and 70s, were only possible to identify as pre-emergent retrospectively, when we kind of know where we are now and try to look back for the roots of how we got to where we are now. A counter example is the Industrial Revolution itself. One thing we clearly know in retrospect is that a negative consequence of the Industrial Revolution is the extreme pressure that is put not only on the Earth's natural resources, but on the sustainability of the entire planet and all of us on it. So things like dominant, residual, emergent, and pre-emergent, they are only really known and knowable in hindsight. To the extent that that is also true of the zeitgeist, I would say that's a useful way of thinking about it. With the caveat, with the warning that I think people tend to talk about zeitgeists in compartments like that, whereas Williams tends to emphasize long-term connections between different historical periods, even when they seem quite different on the outside. If I may, moving from that question to the one about the shift in educational culture and the shift in educational practice, I would say that that is really about the transition between a functional approach to literacy and a functional approach to education, and a participatory one. So Williams is very scornful of the idea that the Industrial Revolution created the need for people to go to school and fill particular places in the industrial order and learn to be, as it were, cogs in a machine. For him, the whole point of critical educational praxis is that we move beyond the idea of functional literacy, and that some kind of critical consciousness comes about through education. It seems to me that there are numerous really, really rich potential connections between Williams and Freire, and this is very clearly one of them. In my section about Freire, I started off by talking about the idea that education doesn't just follow on from political revolution. In a leading sense, education actually has to lead revolutionary change, because education is where critical consciousness comes from. And with critical consciousness comes the impulse and momentum towards revolutionary change in the first place. So that whole thing gets flipped on its head in Freire, just as it does in Williams. Plus, of course, there's that overwhelming commitment to dialogue as a method. One of the things that is really interesting is that both of those figures, Williams and Freire, seem to have felt moved towards the form of the spoken book towards the end of their careers. In Williams, it's Politics and Letters, which is a series of substantial published interviews, which in effect is a retrospective look at his own work in theory, in which he and the New Left Review editors are in effect co-creators. So in the process, the status of authorship is also downgraded, as it were. Williams is not keen on the individual status of the hero, as it were. He's interested in collaboration. And Freire does the same, doesn't he? He too has a dialogic spoken book in which his role, as it were, as hero is somewhat downgraded, because he doesn't want to present himself as the heroic leader of the revolution. He wants to participate as a collaborator or a co-creator of new meaning. So in that dialogic method, in the forms of their written work, in the sense of process, and overwhelmingly in that shift from functional literacy to critical literacy. These are the things that I also think they have in common. There's a wonderful comment by Freire sometimes in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he's talking about getting outside the classroom, because he's setting up a kind of educational practice which has to be relevant to the people in the circumstances they're in. And he says, because we're the kind of people we are, we love classrooms and couldn't live without them. But of course, at times, we have to go outside them to carry out this kind of education. It can't be bounded in that way. The final question was about the creation of new meaning in neoliberal and perhaps neo-fascist Brazil today, this is a question which, to a certain extent, I am not qualified to answer, certainly not in the singular. I hope that some of the ideas that I presented here from both Williams and Freire are useful concepts in that debate. That debate, it seems to me, is something that bears on how we critique neoliberalism in general. And actually what's interesting is that that would not necessarily be specific to Brazil. The questions I find relevant to my critique of neoliberalism, I understand mainly from what's happening in my own society in Britain, and I see relevant examples in Trump's America and various other societies around the world. Always, I think, the key word here actually is hope. The concepts that Williams develops, the new kind of practical forms that Freire was interested in, are all about the belief that things can be better. So that rather than a despair narrative of fascist ideological takeover and its consequences, there is a belief that through the articulation of values, through carefully explaining and disseminating those values and putting them into practice, the ideology of fascism, say, or neoliberalism, say, can be challenged. I'd be interested in knowing what you think about that particular question.
Muito bom, professor. Bom.
Excellent, very good. That is a good question for us to ponder on. And I must say that we received more questions through YouTube, but because of the late hour, and we've been here for many hours now, I think we could wrap up this chat, this dialogue between Freire and Paul Williams and Emerson that Professor Dix brought us has been raised. We should prolong it, and I must say once again thank you to Professor Dix for his speech, for his presentation, and his closure speech. I think that special day that was the closure of the centennial of Paulo Freire and Williams. This is the first day with fantastic speeches with several professors, Professor Mazza, Daniel Williams, Professor Maria Vasco, and now Professor Dix, closing our day by its views, by the hope it gives, by the words, by the structures raised, by the possibility of transforming these present experiences that are so important and fractured that, as they are. Before we wrap up, I would like to give a few announcements so that we can close today's event. Nima, since I have been talking, I will proceed and then I'll give you the floor. I would like to begin by expressing our gratitude to all those who followed us on YouTube, on the Brazilian as well as the English channel. Thank you very much for your questions. I wrote down the questions that were asked that would not be answered, and I would like to invite you all to the Williams, the journeys that we'll have from September on. The first one is on September 14th with groups of researchers and professors from Brazil who have worked on Raymond Williams and who will carry out activities in September, October, November, and December. And the event will close in December. We hope everything will work. We will have a book that will be launched in December, combining precisely those topics. The speakers are invited to be part of it, in addition to the professors who will participate of these journeys. Come meet us. It will be on this channel once again, and it will be a very gratifying experience. We hope to see Professor Diggs, Daniel, and the others with us at the end of all this experience in December. So this said, once again, I thank you, and I give the floor to Professor Nima. Thank you very much, Professor Alexandro. We are all here so very moved by what was said, and we really missed moments such as this, in which we can be close, even though remotely and virtually. I felt very close to everyone today, even though it was through a screen and across oceans. But we felt united by the thoughts of two educators who are linked to our practices, our projects, our research. So I hope many other events will come. Let's not wait another 100 years to have this kind of event. I was asked to talk about some events that are on our agenda for the Faculty of Education and that are focused on the 100th anniversary of Paulo Freire. And please always access, if possible, the institutional page, website, I'm sorry. It's fpu.unicamp.br. On the top, you have a red tag with the celebration of Paulo Freire. We can click on that and you'll be taken to the agenda that is being updated continuously. I wrote down the next events. We have the 6th Political Pedagogical Journey, Paulo Freire. That is an event organized by myself and Professor Magda. And this year, it will get one word, springtime, because it's on the 25th to 27th of October. We will have, therefore, this springtime agenda on the thoughts and ideas of Paulo Freire in partnership with the Greenland University and Professor Camila Coimbra, who is partner in this label. And I'll be part of a roundtable called the Three Marias. And there are also the three daughters of Paulo: Maria Madalena, Maria Cristina, and Maria de Fátima. We also have the Educational Week organized by CAP, the Pedagogical Academic Center Marielle Franca. It will be in October, and the whole week will be focused on the centennial of Paulo Freire. We also have a course, 100 Years of Paulo Freire, a Hope in the Face of Barbarism. And it is it's already taking place. It's by the Faculty of Education, and I think it's the course that has the greatest number of students attending. And we have a GEMC forum that has been taking place monthly. This year, the main topic is Paulo Freire as well. On September 11th, we'll have the Horizon of the Viable Unforecast event. We'll have Professor Cesar Nunes. And on the October 10th, 14th October, we'll have Paulo Freire in Unicamp, an event who has Professor Débora Mazza, Professor Pedro Borg, and Adriana Varangas. Well, this is to give you a taste of what's to come. Please do go there to our www.fe.br, and we keep on being united under Freire. And thank you very much for this morning, this afternoon, and for this opportunity of having sparks of hope and of light. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nima. I will give the floor to Débora. And I forgot to thank Professor Nima and Professor Débora. And we are working together, after all, to have these events. And I would like to thank Professor René as well, of course, for my thanks for the final moments. And then we have Débora, and then it's Nima. Thank you very much. I would like to thank all our participants from all the round tables who were with us during this day of research, of work, and training of teachers and educators. I believe that Paulo Freire, as much as Raymond Williams, as the authors of a time that was the 20th century, they are deeply linked to the social, political, and economic dynamics of the 20th century by the wars, the miseries, the authoritarian regimes, by the Mocambos, by the suburbs, by the exclusions in several ways. Exclusions of participation in symbolic riches that are produced by society, as well as material riches, and both have dedicated their life to education. Both are professors and have worked terribly hard to create connections between hegemonic culture and the concrete conditions for existence of the working class, and the role that an education that raises awareness could play between the excluding past and the possibilities of a more participative future, more collective, more socialist, and more egalitarian future. Culture in both is very relevant, but education and work as well of the educator. And in that sense, both authors' works should be retaken, revisited, and its contemporary aspects, and in moments in which we are going, in Brazil as well as abroad, in processes of unwinding of basic achievements that were attained by our very fragile democratic regimes. The conservative invasion that has been invading all these spheres of social lives, transforming rights and services, and transforming society into a market. The pedagogy of the oppressed of Paulo Freire and the strategic of Raymond Williams aim to reach the hearts and the minds and the bodies. And that is the challenge. And that is the positive and dialectical sense that this debate has raised. We must distinguish here, and I will conclude in a circular way. As Alexandro said, we must distinguish the seeds of life from the seeds of death. The cultural policy and class awareness are resistance movements. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you very much to the whole technical team, to the people who organized this, and to our colleagues who participated in these debates. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Débora. That's so beautiful. I would like to say that we have the event promoted by Professor Daniel Williams in Swansea University, and we're going to make it public as well and disclose it. So just wait for more announcements. And finally, René, thank you very much for your help, your support, your confidence in us, and I will now give you the floor. Thank you. Thank you very much. There's not much more to say, except greet all the participants and greet the people who organized this event and thank them, Professor Débora, the tech team, all the teams who worked for this event, everyone who cooperated for the production of this event, a historical event in the Faculty of Education, not only because of its importance, but also because of its political dimension, but also because of its academic weight and size that was given by its guests and participants and those who participated on YouTube sending their questions. So we are really grateful. We thank you very much. And we also hope we can repeat this experience other times. To conclude, I would like to remind you of a small part of Professor Maria Elisa's speech. She said that we must also make flow the meaning of values that lead to a socialist life, so to speak, not in these words, but basically that's what she said. If we have any hope, any initiative with regards to overcoming capitalist society, which for many of us is the main source of inequality and the problems that we want solved, we must invest in education, because education within and outside school is one of the ways to make flow values, ideas, and notions that will take us to a different society based on other values such as justice and society. It's nice to wrap up an event when following this line of thought, and this calls us and makes to our responsibilities, because we work in a course that trains teachers. So it's a huge responsibility thinking of having a future professionals that are trained by us, who will be the ones who will sow the seeds for other Brazilians that will take us to a different society. So we cannot give up. We have to persevere, and we have to look in the objective conditions that we have at hand, the paths to carry out this pedagogy of the oppressed. Thank you very much to all of you. I hope you have a wonderful end of the afternoon. For those who are in Europe, great evening, and I hope we'll meet one another soon, face to face. Thank you very much to all of you. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much.